Hello, my world history students. This is week 3 of our video lessons, and today I have a special lesson for you. We are going to be talking about the bubonic plague. So I know that you guys have a lot of interest in this, and we've talked about plague doctors and the masks before in class, so hopefully you'll get a lot more information today about the bubonic plague. So let's get right into it. Natural disasters, wars, and pestilence have continually affected the size of Earth's population. Abandoned churches, ruins of castles and wars, and remnants of towns created centuries ago remind us of lost civilizations. But one tiny insect, the flea, did what no army could. Fleas spread bubonic plague, a pandemic we refer to now as the Black Death. 14th century Europe was very different from today. There were few advancements in medicine, and the borders of countries were ever changing. After the Crusades, trade played a larger part of the economy. Ships laden with spices and silks made their way from the Middle East to the kitchens and closets of the rich in Europe. But in the mid-1300s, something else was along for the ride: rats, those pesky rodents. Rats have always been common on board ships, in city sewers and garbage dumps for millennia. Unbeknownst to people, some of the rats of the 14th century carried a horrible disease, the bubonic plague. The bacterium Yersinia pestis infected fleas. Fleas hitched a ride on rats. The rats traveled all around the world, unknown carriers of the disease. Fleas need a live host, and when the rat that carried them died, they spread the disease to people by biting them. In the 1300s, the disease struck without warning or mercy. Once bitten, a person would become ill in as little as 3 days. Within 5 days, most would die. The name Black Death probably referred to the black color that appeared on the body, a signal that the bubonic plague had found its next victim. So you were kind of marked by death by that point, and you basically knew you were going to die. Between 1346 and 1353, an estimated 75 million people across Europe, Africa, and Asia were killed by the Black Death. Figures are hard to determine because of the lack of population counts and the need for mass graves. It was killing so many people so quickly that we really don't know the exact amount of people who died. The dead comprised more than 1/3 of the entire European population at that time. The infection may have originated in southern Russia or central China, where it also killed millions. As loads of silk, porcelain, and spices were moved along the recently expanded trade routes, the disease found new paths to spread. So remember last week we talked about the Silk Road and how it gave us culture, and we were able to trade spices and information across the Silk Road with Marco Polo and his travels. So even though we're traveling and we're having a lot of exchanging between different cultures and people, one of the side effects of that is disease. Just like Columbus came to America and brought disease with him, so did people traveling between continents at the time. Doctors in the Middle Ages rarely went against the church's belief that people were ill because they had sinned. So that was the common belief back then, that if you were physically ill, it was because you have sinned and you haven't repent for your sins. Remember, the church was the number one important part of your life and community during that time. Treatments at the time included herbs, potions, and bloodletting. Remember bloodletting, where they would take out all your blood because they thought it was poisoned? Not a good idea. Physicians felt that certain illnesses were caused by having too much blood in the body. With the plague, other remedies varied from washing the patient in vinegar and rose water, encouraging the eating of only good-smelling foods like vegetables and fruit, and even lancing or cutting off swollen areas to release the disease. Had they realized the disease was spread by rats and fleas, people might have spent more time on sanitation and rodent extermination instead of their weird remedies that they thought would help. We talked about that a little bit before we left for break, about all the weird ways that in the medieval times doctors caused more problems than they fixed. All right, so I'm not going to talk about Ring Around the Rosie, but we talked about that a little bit again in school before we left, about what the nursery rhyme meant, and it was a warning about the Black Death. All right, So just about every area in Europe, much of Asia, and parts of Africa were touched by the Black Death. The only way to avoid the plague was to avoid where it was. If you lived in an area where trade didn't take place, you were spared because people were not coming and going along those trading routes. So as trade became more popular and profitable, few areas fell into this category. You would have to live in a land so remote that you were beyond trade routes. People there would have been living a simple agrarian lifestyle without exposure to the newly discovered foods and textiles of Asia and the Middle East. Or maybe you lived in an area where the economy saved you. Maybe trade had slowed because of the plague and your community didn't receive the goods you were waiting for. The loss of income spared you the loss of life. Lightly populated, rarely visited areas saw little damage from the plague. Iceland and Finland survived the plague because of their location and very small populations. An area between Spain and France in the Pyrenees Mountains was also largely untouched. These areas had little contact with the major trade routes. Large cities to the south, on the other hand, were not so lucky. So the bigger city it is, the more easily the plague can spread between people and animals. Italian trade hubs, Genoa and Venice, quickly succumbed to the disease. Hundreds of thousands died in the crowded cities. Entire populations of smaller villages virtually disappeared. Milan was spared partly because leaders locked the first victims inside their own homes, kind of like what we're doing now. They're quarantining people so that it couldn't spread. This seemingly cruel act probably spared thousands from exposure and certain death. Cold winter temperatures slowed the spread since fleas couldn't survive bitter temperatures, and fleas were the ones carrying the disease. Even with a pause in the winter, the disease raged again when the temperatures climbed. Areas with warm Mediterranean climates saw little reprieve from the disease. It seemed even the plague was affected by the ongoing Muslim-Christian disputes, or the Crusades. The ruler of the land where Russia now sits was a converted Muslim who refused to trade with the Christians. By stopping trade, he temporarily halted the spread of the plague to Russia. However, the disease did eventually make its way by taking a northeasterly course, casting one last swath of death before it died out. All right, using a map, it is possible then to follow the spread of the plague from country to country and port to port. The disease's rapid spread was due to large numbers of ships traveling faster and farther than they ever had before. Unwitting captains helped spread the disease with every stop they made. Too often, they quickly made for the next port or home when news of an outbreak was reported. The disease spared a few, but attacked women and children with little remorse. Much of the population at that time was malnourished. Remember, a lot of people were hungry at this time, which made death more likely. So if you're starving, your body is more susceptible to disease because you don't have the strength to fight it off. All right, let's talk about some of the medical technology during this time. We live in an age where we have access to some amazing medical treatment. A combination of scientific inquiry and the development of new technologies have made what was once considered impossible possible. Just in the past 10 years alone, there have been advancements in medicine. The laparoscopic surgery, which is a minimally invasive surgery, robotic surgery, better cancer treatments, and the invention of bionic limbs. It isn't just in the US where medical knowledge has grown. Governments around the world are working together to reduce or eradicate diseases. The World Health Organization works in 150 countries to provide leadership, research, and support for disease control. In the US, the sole purpose of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, is to protect Americans from health, safety, and security threats. The CDC works with other nations and WHO to prevent the spread of diseases. So this is exactly what our government is doing right now. Okay, so the CDC is working, our Center for Disease Control is working with other governments in other countries to stop the spread of COVID, same as they did with the plague. All right, advancements in communication have helped too. Huge leaps in 20th century technology enable information to be passed much farther and faster than before. Here in the 21st century, we have the ability to connect one another just about anywhere on Earth using cellular and satellite phones. Information about outbreaks, new diseases, or successful treatments can be broadcast instantly, okay? So if this was happening maybe God, even 500 years ago, we would see more death and more struggle than we do now because we weren't able to get the information as quickly. With the internet, we can instantly know if something is wrong. The advent of penicillin back in the 1930s introduced the world to antibiotics. Countless lives around the world were saved from diseases that would have meant a death sentence just a few years earlier. If antibiotics had been available during the bubonic plague era, we would be living in a very different world than we do today. Actual population figures from the 14th century are difficult to know. So too is the total number of deaths, because so many people were buried in the mass graves or thrown into rivers. It is believed that it took the European population well over 300 years to rebound from the death of the bubonic plague and the people. The bubonic plague affected every area of human life and culture. It affected trade, the arts, science, and medicine. Okay? So what is the role of the church in all of this? We've talked at length about the importance of the church and life in Europe at this time. So in times of great need, many people turn to their faith for guidance and support. We still do this to this day. Church is a huge supporter of community. That's exactly what people did in the 1340s, while the Black Death was ravaging Europe and East Asia. Without a known cause for the plague, the Catholic Church seemed an apt place to find comfort and answers. Unfortunately, the clergy had no more information than the medical professionals at the time. The Catholic Church had preached for centuries that illness was caused by sin, so many clergies believed the Black Death was sent by God as punishment for the people's sins. The church believed that last rites must be given to someone before they died to grant them entrance into heaven. The Black Death killed so many people that it was hard to keep up with burials and fewer members of the clergy to give those last rites. Instead, Pope Clement VI granted all plague victims forgiveness of their sins, regardless of religious affiliation, race, gender, or nationality. That was very rare for the church to do that. Pope Clement somehow survived the Black Death. He consulted prominent physicians and astronomers, and some of them advised him to surround himself with torches, as fire would protect him from the infection. This actually worked, not because of the alleged properties of fire, but because heat prevented the infected fleas from reaching his body, and he never contracted the disease. So it wasn't really him being smart about it, it was just an unexpected good thing to come out of that. The Pope also did something else that was unusual at the time, probably saving thousands of lives. He consecrated or made holy the Rhone River, which flows into the Mediterranean Sea near the France-Italy border. This allowed the bodies of the plague victims to be buried in the river and flow away from the population, probably reducing the spread of the disease. All right. So let's talk about pandemics. What is a pandemic? We're going through a pandemic right now. A pandemic is an infectious disease that spreads over a large part of the world. The Black Death was a pandemic. Could it happen again? We're kind of in the midst of something like this, not to the extent of the Black Plague, obviously, but it's still a pandemic. Just a few years ago, the world experienced a pandemic known as the avian flu. How did people react? The media covered it with major headlines, but there was little panic. The US poultry industry was closely watched. Worldwide deaths were low, and it just didn't concern many people, but it was a major wake-up call. What would happen if a major pandemic happened today? It's happening right now. First of all, governments would immediately shut down air travel to try and keep the disease from spreading. Now, we haven't shut down air travel, but we're limiting it. Tourism would cease. Vegas right now is closed. That is our huge tourism epicenter, okay? Trade would be affected. We're limiting our trade with other countries and who we are coming in contact with. Religious inspection of imported food and goods must be stopped completely or ceased, okay? Populations are greatly impacted by major pandemics. The bubonic plague decimated millions across the globe. Remember, a third of the European population died because of this. In some cases, entire towns ceased to exist. and in the death toll of 50 million people from the 1918 Spanish flu. And you're going to see that the population of human life on Earth has been seriously affected by pandemics, just like our population right now is being affected by COVID. Nations around the world work to prevent future pandemics from occurring. They even hold joint exercises to rehearse a response to possible pandemics. The US has agencies like Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to work locally, regionally, and nationally on prevention measures. Thanks to the advance of modern medicine following a healthier lifestyle, using better sanitation practices, and eradicating or dying off of disease-carrying agents, we have a better chance of avoiding the pandemics of the past. So it's good that we were at least prepared for this. We've done drills for this, okay? So we've seen the 1918 Spanish flu, we've seen SARS, and now we have COVID. So we're prepared for this. Even though it seems we're not, we are as prepared as we possibly could be for pandemics, okay? All right, last thing I want to talk about is the timeline of the Black Death. So the years of the Black Death are generally given as 1346 to 1353. Okay, so those are the years that the bubonic plague was in Europe. Okay, the plague, though, wasn't a one-time event. Okay, so the first recorded mention of the plague can be traced back to the year 541, but it was known as the Justinian plague, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. This outbreak would run for the next 200 years, killing 25 million people. It too was centered around the Mediterranean Sea, an area where most human life in Europe was located at the time. Okay, other outbreaks have occurred in London in 1660 and Moscow in 1771. Okay. A third plague, known as the modern plague, was thought to have originated in China in the 1860s. It was carried around the world for the next 20 years by rats moving from ship to ship and port to port. This outbreak was blamed for 10 million deaths worldwide. It was during this specific epidemic that scientists finally found the cause: infected rats and fleas. For the most part, with an emphasis today on ridding urban areas of rats, we are seeing the disease die out finally worldwide. Okay, so I know this is worrying to you, all these people dying, these events, and I don't want this to be alarming to you. This is history, so we have precedent for this. Obviously, we're not living in a time where the bubonic plague, would kill that many people. We have technology and medical advancements that even if a pandemic happens like it does now, we can be more prepared, or prepared as much as we can be for a pandemic. So this isn't to scare you and say that everyone's going to die, because that is not the case. That we're talking about centuries and centuries ago, okay, and how the Europeans dealt with bubonic plague. So let that digest. That was a long lesson. Let that all sink in. So this week we're going to do something a little different. Instead of me holding up my whiteboard with questions, I am going to copy a link to the description on this video that you can click on, okay? And it's going to be a T-chart of causes and effects of the bubonic plague. So if you listen to this video lesson, then you're going to be able to fill out the T-chart with causes and effects. Okay, so remember, you're going to scroll down to the description of the YouTube video, click on the link, and you can either write down your answers and show me your T-chart in our Wednesday Zoom meeting at 9:30, or you can email me your answers if you'd like to. That's completely up to you how you'd like to show me your work, okay? So I look forward to seeing you guys Wednesday, and I hope you had a good weekend. Bye.